Imagine for a moment a silent man, alone in a small room. The soft light of a candle dances on the walls, illuminating the face of a spiritual leader whose eyes seem to look beyond the present, touching something much deeper. Pope Francis, already in his last days, holds a crucifix in his hands, and as he observes the figure that symbolizes pain and sacrifice, he begins to reflect in a low voice on something that few would imagine hearing. What he is about to reveal is not a theological doctrine, but a truth that transcends centuries of tradition, something that completely changes the way we see the Savior. What is he about to reveal about Jesus? What could change in the way we understand the Savior? These questions echo in the silence of the room, as if the answer is waiting to be discovered. And then, in a gentle way, he begins to speak. Jesus is not only the Son of God, he is the face of God's tears. Have you ever stopped to think about it? What would it be like if Jesus were more than the image we were taught in the churches? What if, instead of being seen as a distant king, he was actually someone who shares our deepest pains, who weeps with us in the darkest nights? This revelation of Pope Francis is not limited to a theological concept or a dogmatic vision. He goes further. He's telling us that Jesus, the Son of God, did not come to be worshipped as a figure of power, but to accompany us in our afflictions, to be present in our tears. Before we continue, if you are enjoying this deep reflection on the role of Jesus in our lives, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Also, share in the comments what you think about Pope Francis' view on human suffering and how it can impact your faith. For a long time, many believed that Jesus was a figure of suffering, but that this suffering was limited to an isolated event, the cross. Pope Francis, however, invites us to look at Jesus in a completely new way. He challenges us to see Jesus not as a distant hero, but as a faithful companion who, over the centuries, has stood by all those who suffer, whether on the streets of a war-torn city, in refugee camps where hope seems absent, or in hospital beds where pain is silent and lonely. And this is the key to Francis's revelation. Jesus did not turn away from human suffering, he took it for himself. In his last words, Francis invites us to change our perspective. It is no longer about worshipping a distant Christ, but about following a present Christ, a Christ who walks with us, who feels our pains, and who never abandons us. This is not just the vision of an elderly man reflecting on death. It is not an isolated idea or a personal interpretation. Pope Francis is sharing something much deeper, something that can transform our understanding of Christianity, faith, and most importantly, our relationship with Jesus. Are you ready to listen to what he has to say? The truth he revealed before he left can forever change the way you look at the picture of Christ. Pope Francis, in his latest reflections, has revealed something that deeply touches our understanding of Jesus. He is not only a symbol of distant divinity, but also a human being who has shared and still shares the suffering of the world. The Pope explained that for a long time, Jesus was seen only as a figure of sacrifice, a figure who suffered for us on the cross. But he suggested that this limited view was not enough to capture the totality of Christ's humanity. Jesus did not come to be worshipped as an emperor, Francis said. He came to accompany us in our afflictions. Jesus' suffering was not something that occurred only during the crucifixion. Pope Francis invites us to look at Jesus in a deeper and more constant way. Jesus' pain is not only stuck in the past, but lives on in those who suffer today. Jesus is with refugees, with victims of war, with the sick who face pain without relief. To better understand this perspective, we must look at the historical context in which Pope Francis was based. In 2013, the Pope made one of the first major apostolic visits to Lebanon, a country torn apart by civil war and regional conflicts. During his visit, he met with victims of the Syrian war, including refugee families and traumatized children. These experiences had a major impact on his view of human suffering and shaped his reflections on Jesus. In his encyclicals, such as Evangelii Gaudium 2013, Francis has often mentioned the importance of reaching out to the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed. He was not limited to a spiritualist vision, but brought the understanding that true faith is manifested in the care of those who suffer the most. The Pope has always emphasized that Christianity is not a religion of appearances, but of concrete action to alleviate the suffering of others. This view of human suffering is also reflected in the theology of other great Christian thinkers, such as the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, who in his work Theology of Hope, 1964, spoke about the God who suffers, highlighting that in the suffering of Christ, God sympathizes with the pain of humanity. Moltmann argues that the cross was not just an isolated event, but an event that reverberates throughout history, connecting with every human suffering. In 2015, Pope Francis declared, during a Mass in honor of refugees, that Jesus continues to suffer in the poor, in abandoned children, in the sick without care. He stressed that the cross of Christ is not just a symbol, but a living expression of solidarity with all those who, over the centuries, continue to bear the weight of human suffering. Pope Francis, therefore, not only reminds us of the humanity of Jesus, but challenges us to look at the suffering happening around us. The pain of others, whether in war zones, slums, or hospitals, must be recognized as an extension of Christ's suffering. The Gospel, therefore, is not only a story of a man who died 2,000 years ago, it is an invitation to live the reality of the suffering Christ in the present. This deeper, more contemporary understanding of Jesus' suffering is critical to understanding the true Christian message. The pain of Jesus, according to Francis, is not a distant memory, but a living presence that calls us to act, to accompany those who suffer, and to live the faith in a concrete and solidary way. When we think of the cross, we are often led to imagine an isolated act of suffering. The traditional view of the cross, especially in Western Christianity, often sees it as the end of a painful journey, a sacrifice that was made for us. But Pope Francis challenges that view. He invites us to look at the cross not only as a sacrifice, but as a profound symbolism of union. The cross, for Francis, is not a simple event of atonement. He describes it as an eternal union between God and humanity. Rather than a transaction where Jesus sacrificed himself to pay for the sins of humanity, the cross represents the moment when Jesus permanently unites himself with human suffering. This concept challenges the traditional idea of a distant and impassive God. For the Pope, Jesus was not only paying for our sins, but uniting himself with our suffering, taking it as his own. This understanding of Christ on the cross is also a critique of interpretations that turn Jesus' suffering into an impersonal event. Francis reminds us that the cross is a marriage, an intimate union between God and humans, between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human. Jesus did not simply endure the pain of crucifixion, he united himself to it in a deep and existential way. In doing so, he has shown us that we are not alone in our pain. This idea may seem surprising, but it has deep roots in Christian theology. One of the most influential thinkers on this concept was the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, in his work The Cost of Discipleship, 1937, wrote about suffering as an essential part of the Christian life. Bonhoeffer argued that Christianity is not a faith that shirks suffering, but one that finds God's presence precisely in suffering. In his theology, the cross is not a symbol of defeat, but of unity and solidarity. Pope Francis takes up this thought, saying that the cross is not a symbol of solitary suffering, but the meeting point between God and the human being. Christ's death on the cross was not only a divine obligation, but the moment of greatest intimacy between humanity and God. It was not just a sacrifice, Francis said. It was a way for God to permanently unite himself to our suffering. This is a crucial point in his vision. God is not distant in our suffering. He is with us, carrying pain by our side. To give even more weight to this idea, we can reflect on how Jesus faced the cross. He did, in fact, ask for another way. In Luke 22:42, Jesus says, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." These words show a humanity of Jesus that even though he was divine, still struggled with pain, with the idea of facing the cross. However, he did not turn away. On the contrary, he embraced it as the path to the deepest possible union with humanity. This approach of Francis challenges us to change our own relationship with suffering. The cross of Christ should not be seen merely as an act of atonement that took place at a fixed point in history. It should be seen as a continuing expression of God's presence in the world. Every time we suffer, every time we feel the weight of human pain, we can remember that Christ was once there and is there again with us. By understanding the cross in this way, we can begin to see our own difficulties from a new perspective. Suffering is no longer an isolated situation or a divine punishment, but an opportunity to live the union with God that was established on the cross. Christ, on the cross, not only died for us, but died to unite himself to us, so that we would never again be alone in our struggles. The cross, therefore, becomes a symbol of hope, of divine presence in the darkest hours. One of the greatest revelations made by Pope Francis was the transformation of the way we see the presence of Jesus in the world. Contrary to the idea of a Christ who is found only in temples, in the luxury of churches, or in grandiose ceremonies, the Pope challenges us to perceive Jesus in the places where people are most forgotten and abandoned. Jesus, for Francis, is not far from human pain. It is at the heart of the suffering of those who live on the margins of society. In his various trips and statements, Pope Francis has emphasized that Jesus continues to live on the peripheries of the world. He often referred to these as the margins. This is not just a religious metaphor, but a call to action for Christians to turn to those who are ignored by society, who live on the streets, who are homeless, who are victims of violence and persecution. Francis, who has a long history of working with the poor and the marginalized, has met with refugees, slum dwellers and prisoners, and in each of these meetings he stresses that there is the true presence of Christ. For him, the true Christian faith is not revealed in sumptuous liturgies, but in the attention given to the most needy, to those who have no voice, and to those who are constantly ignored. This vision of Christ on the margins finds resonance in various historical moments. For example, during his visit to the refugee camp in Lesbos, Greece, in 2016, Pope Francis highlighted the dehumanization that many refugees face, being treated as numbers or statistics, rather than as people with stories and dignity. He brought back the image of Christ as the one who walks alongside the excluded, those who have nowhere to go, reminding us that the humanity of Jesus is not something of the past, but a living reality. This vision of a Christ present on the margins also echoes in the words of theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, one of the founders of liberation theology. Gutierrez, in his work Liberation Theology, 1971, argues that true Christian mission lies in working alongside the poor and oppressed, seeking social justice and alleviating suffering. Christ's mission, according to Gutierrez, was not only to save souls, but also to transform the social structures that cause poverty and oppression. He saw Jesus as someone who was on the social peripheries, someone who joined the suffering and struggle of the marginalized. Pope Francis, in embracing this vision, invites us to look at Jesus not as a distant figure, but as someone who walks with us in the most difficult streets, among those who suffer in silence. The message of Christ is not found only in words or in the ceremonies of the Church, but in the real and immediate care of those most in need. In his encyclicals, Francis also speaks of the throwaway culture that marks modern societies, where the poor, the sick, and the marginalized are often ignored. For him, Christ is in the encounter with these people. It is a powerful message which challenges us to act and to recognize Jesus in the most challenging situations of human life. The question he asks us is, where is Jesus for you? Are we looking to him where he needs us most, or are we expecting to see him only in moments of greatness? Thus, human suffering, when looked at from the perspective of Pope Francis, is not something to be avoided, but something to be faced. Jesus is not on the golden throne, but by our side, in the shadows, in the slums, and in the hospitals, offering true mercy and compassion. He calls us to step out of our comfort zone and to the margins, where pain is rawest, where life is hardest, and where true love and true compassion can transform reality. One of the most profound messages conveyed by Pope Francis in his latest reflections is about the nature of the Christian faith. He challenges us to rethink the way we live our spirituality, questioning whether we truly understand the essence of Jesus or whether we just follow empty rituals. Francis points out that over the centuries, faith has become a practice full of norms, ceremonies, and symbols, but often far from the true message of Christ: love, compassion, and forgiveness. I have not come to be understood, I have come to accompany me, the Pope said, citing a profound spiritual revelation he had. This seemingly simple phrase reveals a radical transformation in the way we should relate to Jesus. It's not about understanding or explaining what he did, but about walking alongside him at every step, especially in times of suffering and desolation. Faith, Francis said, should not be a matter of knowing or believing doctrines, but of following Christ's example, embracing the pain and difficulties of life. However, faith should not just be a set of beliefs, but an experience lived authentically. Religion, for the Pope, has often become something mechanical, where rituals have become more important than the very meaning behind them. He notes that the Church often emphasizes the need to follow rules and norms, but forgets that, first of all, faith is a personal encounter with Jesus, who calls us to go beyond rituals and to live what he really taught. This view also connects with the words of Saint Augustine, who already in the 4th century questioned the superficial religiosity of his time. In his work, Confessions, Augustine writes, "You have made us for you, Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." For Augustine, true faith was not in following rituals or religious norms, but in finding peace and true relationship with God. Pope Francis rescues this principle, reminding us that true spirituality is the one that leads us to an authentic and transformative relationship with Jesus. If this reflection is touching your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And if you have something to say about what Pope Francis has revealed, share your thoughts in the comments below. We love to hear what you think. This concept of faith is also relevant when we think about the crises of modernity. In times of uncertainty such as wars, economic crises, or social inequalities, faith is often put to the test. However, the Pope reminds us that faith should not be measured only by the amount of our prayers or the ceremonies we participate in, but by the impact of our love and care for others. Like Christ, our faith should be visible in the way we dedicate ourselves to alleviating the suffering of others, serving those most in need, and practicing justice. In his homilies, Francis often spoke about the religiosity of the heart, the idea that true faith is not one that is limited to external practices, but that springs from a transformed interior. True worship, for him, is in the act of giving of oneself to others, of caring for those who suffer, and of seeking a more just and compassionate world. "We have clothed the cross of Jesus with gold," the Pope said, "but we have forgotten to live the pain it represents." This criticism is not just about the church or religious traditions, but about how all of us, as individuals, often forget the true meaning of following Christ. Francis, by emphasizing this vision of faith, calls us to a profound personal and community transformation. he challenges us to abandon the idea of a superficial religiosity and to seek a Jesus who is closer, more human, more accessible. True faith, he said, is not limited to believing in doctrines or following rituals, but to being willing to walk alongside Jesus in every moment of our lives, especially in times of pain and uncertainty. The faith of Christ is not a faith that expects rewards or that boils down to rules. It is a living, active faith that demands more from us than words. It requires actions, compassion, and a real change of heart. Jesus, for Francis, did not come only to be worshipped as a distant figure. He came to be followed, imitated, and above all loved in the pain and suffering of the world. When Pope Francis shared his latest revelations, he was not only offering a reflection on Christ's past, but inviting us to live out a new form of faith in the present. He revealed that Jesus is not just a historical figure or a distant religious symbol. He is a constant presence in human suffering, on the margins of society, where pain is most visible and where the eyes of humanity often wander. The Christ Francis described is not the one who stands on a golden throne waiting for our adoration, but the one who walks beside us on every corner of pain and abandonment. But this revelation doesn't come without a challenge. Jesus, in his humanity, placed himself on the side of the most needy, the poorest, those who are discarded by society. He did not ask us to worship him in lavish temples or in empty rituals. He asked them to follow him, to walk with him in the daily struggle, in the face of adversity, and above all in true compassion for others. The cross was not a simple sacrifice of one man for others. It was the point of union between the human and the divine, where pain was transformed into an eternal bond of love. Now, the question is, how do we respond to this? Francis' message challenges us to rethink our own faith. It is no longer about worshipping Jesus as a distant figure, but about following in his footsteps, loving as he loved, and being in solidarity with those on the margins, with the forgotten and the oppressed. Our faith is no longer measured by the number of masses or prayers we do, but by the way we live this faith on a daily basis, in our actions, in our care for others, especially those who need it most. The real question that Francis has left us is, are we ready to see Jesus where he really is, in the places of suffering, of loneliness, of pain? He is not waiting to be worshipped in churches, but on the streets, in hospitals, in refugee camps. True faith is not manifested in golden statues, but in human touch, in genuine compassion, in presence with those who suffer. So, look around you. Where do you see Jesus today? Perhaps he is closer than you think, not on an altar, but in the eyes of someone who needs help, in the gesture of affection to those who suffer the most. True faith begins when we realize that Jesus never abandons us, but walks with us in every step of our pain. The message is simple. Jesus is not in the past. He lives among us in the moments of greatest need. The question that remains is, are we ready to follow in his footsteps, or will we continue to wait for a distant king? The choice is ours, and the transformation begins now. If you've made it this far, we want to know what you think of this powerful message from Pope Francis. Leave your comment, like the video, and if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now so you don't miss the next content. Tell us, how do you interpret the true presence of Jesus on the margins of society? We look forward to reading your opinion.